The Sibuyan Sea lay deceptively calm. A sheet of endless blue, reflecting the tropical sun, gave no warning of the storm that was about to tear it apart. It was the morning of October 24th, 1944. Across that horizon, a shape like no other cut through the waves. Her steel bow split the ocean, not like a ship, but like a mountain in motion. Thousands of men stood on her decks, their hands gripping railings and anti-aircraft guns, their eyes fixed on the empty sky. They were waiting. Then came the hum, low at first, like a swarm of insects. It grew until it shook the bones in their chests. Distant black dots became wings, not birds, but war. This was the moment the most powerful warship ever built, the battleship Musashi, would meet her fate. For 2 decades before that day, nations had argued not only with diplomats and treaties, but with steel. After the First World War, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 set limits on how many battleships each power could build. To Tokyo, those terms were more than numbers on paper. They were humiliation, a reminder that Japan would always be considered the lesser partner in a world ruled by Britain and the United States. The Japanese High Command saw the truth. They could never win a contest of numbers. America could launch ship after ship, faster than Japan could replace a single vessel. The answer, they believed, was not to compete in quantity at all. Instead, they chose to pursue something no other nation would dare attempt. They would build ships so massive, so heavily armed, so indestructible, that a single one could outgun an entire enemy task force. The doctrine was called Kai Kessan, the decisive battle. The idea was simple in words, impossible in practice. Lure the United States fleet into one great clash, win it in overwhelming fashion, and force America to negotiate. To make that plan real, Japan ignored treaties and began construction in secret. Out of that gamble came a new breed of warship. She was longer, wider, and heavier than any other. Her main battery was 9 giant guns, each so large that Japan had to build special transports just to carry them from factory to shipyard. She was called Musashi, and her sister was Yamato. By the time she entered service in 1942, Musashi represented more than steel. She was national pride afloat. She was meant to change the very rules of naval war. Yet as the tide of the conflict turned against Japan, her great guns remained silent, her crew restless. The age of the battleship was slipping away, and when her silence finally ended, it was not against another leviathan of steel. It was under a sky blackened by swarms of American aircraft. Long before the thunder of bombs over the Sibuyan Sea, the fate of the battleship Musashi was sealed at a conference table. In the winter of 1922, diplomats gathered in Washington, D.C. to prevent another ruinous naval arms race like the one that had spiraled before the First World War. The Washington Naval Treaty was signed, a document that fixed the maximum size and number of capital ships the great powers could possess. On paper, it seemed fair. In practice, it left Tokyo furious. The treaty allowed Britain and the United States each to build 5 tons of battleships for every 3 tons Japan was permitted. To the admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was not balance. It was humiliation. For them, it meant that no matter how well they trained or how hard their sailors fought, America could always overwhelm them by sheer production. In a war of attrition, Japan would bleed to death. From this bitter truth emerged a radical idea. If Japan could not match the United States ship for ship, then it would build vessels so powerful that each one could fight many opponents at once. They would not aim for parity in numbers, but for supremacy in quality. The concept was named Kai Kessan, the decisive battle doctrine. In this vision, the Japanese fleet would lure America into one massive clash in the Western Pacific. There, with superior firepower and courage, Japan would annihilate the U.S. fleet in a single stroke, forcing Washington to negotiate peace. To achieve such a gamble, Japan needed more than courage. It needed a weapon unlike any the world had seen. By the mid-1930s, engineers and planners secretly drafted blueprints for a class of warship that would dwarf every battleship afloat. They envisioned a displacement of more than 73,000 tons, nearly twice the size of any rival. They armed her with 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted. Each shell was taller than a man and heavy enough to smash through any known armor. Her protective belt of steel was designed to withstand direct hits from the same caliber guns, but secrecy was vital. When the keel of the second ship in this class was laid in 1938 at the Kure Naval Arsenal, a colossal curtain was hung around the dock. It was woven from more than 400 tons of thick rope, rising like a fortress wall to block any view from the surrounding hills. Military police patrolled the area. Workers swore oaths of silence, knowing that punishment for a loose word could be severe. The ship was named Musashi, after a Japanese province, and after the legendary samurai Yamato Musashi, symbol of martial skill and invincibility. From the moment her steel plates began to take shape, she vanished from the public eye. Even Japanese citizens were unaware of her true scale. Every rivet, every armored turret was more than engineering. It was a statement of defiance. Inside, Musashi was not simply a war machine but a floating city. She carried her own power plants and desalination systems to turn seawater into drinkable water. She housed a hospital, kitchens, machine shops, and a Shinto shrine where sailors could bow their heads before battle. Thousands of compartments twisted through her interior, so confusing that painted arrows had to guide crewmen through the maze. Each main gun barrel was so massive that no existing vessel in Japan could transport it. A special transport ship had to be built just to carry one gun at a time from the foundry to the arsenal. Her designers intended that no foreign shell could pierce her armor and that her mighty guns could outrange and outdestroy any enemy afloat. This vision carried enormous cost. At a time when Japan struggled with limited resources, pouring so much steel, labor, and treasure into just 2 ships, Musashi and her sister Yamato, was an audacious gamble. The admirals believed that if the decisive battle ever came, these giants would turn the tide. Yet in truth, the world of war was already moving on. Aircraft carriers were proving themselves in exercises and in early battles. Submarines were showing their deadly reach. Still, the high command clung to the dream that a single warship could embody the nation's pride and alter history itself. By 1942, when Musashi was finally commissioned, she embodied this dream in steel. She was longer than 2 football fields, wider than many city streets, and displaced more water than entire fleets of destroyers. Her silhouette on the horizon was enough to make any sailor's heart sink. She was Japan's trump card, their answer to the limitations imposed by foreign treaties, and their hope for victory in a war that had already begun to slip from their grasp. Yet even as she slid into the Pacific, history whispered another truth. No ship, however mighty, could escape the tides of change. The doctrine of Kai Kessan, the decisive battle, was built on an assumption that America would fight Japan's war on Japan's terms. But wars rarely unfold according to plan. When Musashi entered service in August 1942, Japan was at a crossroads. The tide that had carried the empire across the Pacific was beginning to ebb. Yet, in sheer presence, nothing compared to her. She was immediately chosen as the flagship of the combined fleet, the pride of the Imperial Navy. From her towering bridge, admirals directed campaigns and issued orders that shaped the course of the Pacific War. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was the first to raise his flag aboard her. Later, Admiral Minechi Koga, his successor, also commanded from Musashi's steel decks. For these men, the warship was not just a vessel. She was a throne of steel from which they sought to rule the Pacific. But pride and symbolism could not create battles. Time and again, Musashi sailed with the fleet, a gray mountain of steel moving across endless water, only to find empty horizons. The American Navy, learning fast from early defeats, no longer risked its capital ships in close-range gun duels. Battles were decided hundreds of miles away, in the invisible arcs of aircraft launched from carriers. For the sailors, aboard Musashi, life became a strange exile. They drilled endlessly, firing her great 18-inch guns not at enemy fleets, but at barren reefs or test targets. They practiced damage control, trained anti-aircraft crews, and maintained the massive ship with near-religious devotion. yet they rarely saw combat. Soon, a nickname spread among the crews of both Yamato and Musashi, the Yamato Hotel. The ships were safe, comfortable, and far from the true front lines where submarines, carriers, and smaller vessels fought and died. Frustration grew. Men who had joined the Navy dreaming of decisive duels felt like spectators in the very war they were supposed to win. The irony was sharp. The most powerful battleship in history was sidelined by the very evolution of naval warfare she was meant to dominate. Still, Musashi remained a symbol. Her mere presence tied down American resources. U.S. commanders knew that if the super battleships ever reached a convoy or transport fleet, the damage would be catastrophic. The shadow of her guns influenced strategy even when she never fired them in anger. The illusion of invincibility shattered on the night of March 29, 1944. While steaming from Palau, Musashi was spotted by the American submarine USS Tunney. Through the periscope, her immense outline filled the horizon. The submarine's commander, stunned by her size, ordered a full spread of 6 torpedoes. The ocean erupted moments later. One torpedo slammed into her bow with a deafening explosion. Steel buckled, water rushed into forward compartments, and over 3,000 tons of seawater poured through a gaping 19-foot wound. Yet Musashi did not die. Bulkhead doors slammed shut, pumps roared to life, and she limped back to Japan under her own power. In the dry docks, engineers studied the lesson. The ship's armor had held, but her vulnerability was plain. The danger was not enemy battleships, it was submarines, and above all, aircraft. Her anti-aircraft defenses were overhauled. Dozens of new 25mm guns sprouted from her decks until she bristled like a hedgehog of steel. By the time she re-emerged, more than 130 barrels of anti-aircraft fire lined her flanks. But the truth remained. Without carrier cover, she was still exposed. Her guns could not touch the planes that struck from beyond the horizon. The age of the super battleship was already passing, even as Musashi stood ready, more heavily armed than ever. For her crew, the waiting was unbearable. They had trained for a grand showdown, the Kai Kessan promised by their admirals. Yet, days and months passed with no such battle. The decisive clash seemed always out of reach, just beyond the horizon. Sailors polished brass and steel until it gleamed, ran endless drills, and waited for orders that never came. But history was closing in. Japan's empire was shrinking, island by island, mile by mile. The seas that once carried victory now carried American task forces. In the summer of 1944, as the United States prepared to invade the Philippines, the Imperial Navy made a desperate choice. Operation Shō-Gō was planned, a last audacious strike to smash the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. At the center of this plan was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, and at the heart of that force was Musashi. For the first time, the great battleship would sail into the battle she had been built for. Yet destiny, long delayed, would arrive in a form no one aboard expected. The war she was designed to fight no longer existed. The clash ahead would not be a contest of steel against steel, but of steel against wings. For the men aboard, the order to prepare for Operation Shō-Gō was a thunderclap that broke months of silence. At last, the decisive battle was no longer a dream whispered in wardrooms or carved into training manuals. It was real, and it was coming. The ship's cavernous magazines were stocked with shells the size of railway cars. Her crew drilled with renewed energy, testing anti-aircraft guns until the barrels smoked, rehearsing damage control teams until their muscles trembled. Officers spoke of honor, of duty, of the chance to finally prove Musashi's worth in the war she had been born to fight. Yet beneath the surface of that fierce resolve lay a quiet dread. The sailors had heard stories from Truk, from Saipan, from the Mariana Islands. They knew how swiftly American carrier planes could erase an entire fleet from the sea. Some whispered that the Musashi was too slow, too massive, too visible to survive the kind of air assault that had become America's hallmark. But these doubts remained unspoken. To voice them was to betray not only one's comrades, but the very pride of the empire. So when Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita gathered his officers and outlined the plan, The men listened with straight backs and determined faces. The center force, led by Yamato and Musashi, would break through the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the American transports at Leyte. To the admirals, it was a chance to cut America's lifeline and perhaps, just perhaps, force Washington back to the negotiating table. To the sailors, it was the long-awaited trial by fire. What they could not know was that the trial would not be the battle they imagined. It would not be broadsides at dawn against enemy battleships. It would not be thunderous duels with heavy cruisers. Instead, it would be something far more merciless. Wave after wave of carrier aircraft, a storm from the sky that no amount of steel could hold back. In the early hours of October 22, 1944, the center force slipped quietly from Brunei Bay. It was a massive armada, 5 battleships, including the giants Yamato and Musashi, escorted by 12 cruisers and 15 destroyers. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding from his new flagship Yamato after losing Otago to submarines, drove his fleet toward destiny. On board Musashi, the mood was electric. Sailors sharpened knives, cleaned weapons, and checked ammunition as if preparing for a duel long promised. The great ship herself seemed alive, her boilers rumbling with a low heartbeat that carried through every deck. Officers spoke in hushed voices of honor and sacrifice, for they knew what this battle could mean, not just for the fleet, but for the fate of the empire itself. But destiny does not march in straight lines. Before dawn on October 23rd, 2 American submarines, USS Darter and USS Dace, intercepted Kurita's fleet in the Palawan Passage. Torpedoes ripped through the water, striking with brutal precision. Heavy cruisers Otago and Maya were sent to the bottom, and Kurita himself was forced to leap into the sea before being rescued. The blow was severe, but Kurita pressed on. The plan demanded absolute commitment. By the morning of October 24th, the center force had entered the narrow Sibuyan Sea. The skies were clear, the sea deceptively calm. At 8 o'clock, American reconnaissance planes spotted the fleet. From the decks of the carriers, Intrepid, Essex, and Lexington, pilots climbed into their cockpits. Engines roared to life. Admiral William Halsey's orders were simple: strike and strike hard. At 10:30, the first wave descended. The crew of Musashi saw them first as specks, then as dark wings swarming across the sky. Gongs clanged, sirens wailed, and anti-aircraft gunners swung their barrels skyward. The great battleship shuddered as her guns unleashed forests of fire and black bursts of flak. Yet there were too many. Curtiss Helldivers plummeted in near-vertical dives, sirens howling. Bombs tore through the sky and smashed into steel. One detonated on turret number 1, shaking the entire ship. Another punched deep into her decks, ripping compartments apart with fire and smoke. Almost at the same time, Grumman Avengers skimmed the waves, launching torpedoes in glittering trails of foam. One struck her starboard side. Water gushed in, flooding compartments. The battleship lurched, listing dangerously. Damage control crews raced below, sealing bulkheads and counter-flooding to balance the ship. Slowly, painfully, Musashi righted herself. But this was only the first blow. Minutes later, a second wave arrived, larger and more determined. Bombs tore into her midsection. Torpedoes slammed from both port and starboard, testing her defenses. Her armor screamed under the assault, rivets snapping, steel buckling. Flames erupted across her decks. Sailors were flung through the air, some vanishing in bursts of fire, others crushed beneath twisted beams. Still, she fought on. Her anti-aircraft crews fired until barrels glowed red, the decks littered with spent casings. Smoke stung their eyes, oil coated their boots, and the roar of engines never ceased. Survivors later recalled the deafening chaos, the choking heat, and the eerie sense that the sky itself had turned against them. By early afternoon, Musashi was bleeding from a dozen wounds. Her speed slowed. Her great bow began to dip beneath the waves, yet she refused to die. Vice Admiral Kurita, watching from Yamato, could hardly believe the punishment his sister ship endured. At 2 o'clock, a third wave struck. Once again, Avengers came in low, unleashing torpedoes from multiple angles. At least 4 slammed into her sides. Bombs tore through the decks near her bridge, killing or wounding much of the command staff. The great guns of Musashi remained silent. No enemy battleship was in sight. Her fight was not against steel, but against wings. Lieutenant Dan Smith, a torpedo bomber pilot, later remembered. The last time I saw Musashi, she was dead in the water, her bow nearly submerged. All 8 of our torpedoes hit. For hours, the assault continued. Wave after wave, relentless as the tide, hammered the once mighty warship. By 3:30 in the afternoon, she had absorbed 19 torpedoes and 17 direct bomb hits. Her decks were blackened, her hull torn open, her engines failing. Yet still she clung to life. Smoke rose in towering columns, fires raged unchecked, her list grew steeper, and her bow sank deeper into the sea. Captain Toshihira Inoguchi, who also held the rank of Rear Admiral, knew the truth. The ship was lost. Still, he refused to abandon her. Calmly, he ordered his men to save themselves if they could. Then, he retired to his cabin, where he remained until the end. At 7:15, as the tropical sun slipped beneath the horizon, the order was given: abandon ship. Sailors poured across the slanting decks, some carrying wounded comrades, others leaping into oil-slicked waters. Destroyers braved the chaos to haul survivors aboard. Many clung to ropes, debris, or each other in the blackening sea. 15 minutes later, the giant rolled sharply to port. Her stern rose high, screws glinting in the dying light. For a moment, the great ship seemed to hesitate, as if unwilling to surrender. Then, with a final groan of tortured steel, she plunged bow first into the Sibuyan Sea. Steam and smoke erupted. Then silence. Over 1,000 men went down with her. Those who survived would never forget the sight of their Leviathan sliding into the abyss, a mountain of steel and sorrow swallowed by the deep. Vice Admiral Kurita, watching from a nearby destroyer, felt the weight of the loss press upon him. He still commanded Yamato, other battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. But the psychological blow was immense. Hours later, even with the vulnerable American transports almost within reach, Kurita made a decision that stunned his subordinates. He turned back. The retreat marked not just the end of Operation Shō-Gō's hopes, but the collapse of Japan's dream for a decisive surface victory. The sinking of Musashi was more than the loss of a ship. It was the shattering of an illusion, the belief that steel alone could win a war. Her end marked the death of the battleship era. From that day forward, the seas would belong to carriers and aircraft. For the men who survived the Sibuyan Sea, the memory of that day became a wound carved into the soul. They spoke of the smell first, the acrid stench of burning oil that clung to their clothes, their skin, even their dreams for years afterward. They remembered the heat of the steel deck under their boots as fire spread unchecked, the deafening roar of explosions that drowned out human voices, and the sudden silences that followed each wave of attackers, brief, eerie pauses broken only by the cries of the wounded. Those who leapt into the sea described the water as both salvation and prison. It was thick with oil, black and choking. Some men swallowed it and never resurfaced. Others swam desperately toward destroyers that edged close under constant threat of American planes. Still others clung to floating debris, eyes fixed on the impossible sight of Musashi listing heavily, her massive turrets angled helplessly toward the sky. They had trained for years to fight alongside her, to live within her steel walls, to treat her as home. Now she was a coffin slowly rolling onto her side. When her stern lifted out of the water, screws flashing in the last rays of the sun, many survivors wept openly. A few shouted encouragement to their ship, as if she were alive and could still right herself. But then the bow plunged, the ocean swallowed her, and the sound of her death echoed in a low, drawn-out roar that seemed to shake the very sea. Silence followed, broken only by the slap of waves and the soft sobs of men adrift. In that silence, one truth settled heavily. The pride of the Imperial Navy was gone. On Yamato's bridge, Kurita stared long into the distance where Musashi had vanished. He was a veteran sailor, hardened by decades at sea, but the loss cut him to the bone. He had seen many ships sunk, many crews lost, but Musashi was not just a ship. She was the embodiment of an entire strategy, the physical proof of Japan's belief that one decisive battle could secure victory. Watching her die was like watching the death of that dream. In the hours that followed, Kurita wrestled with his options. Ahead lay Leyte Gulf, crowded with American transports. If his fleet broke through, they could devastate the U.S. invasion. For a moment, the victory promised by Kai Kessan seemed within reach. Yet the psychological shock of losing Musashi lingered. Reports of overwhelming American air power haunted every decision. When morning came and his battered fleet pressed forward, only to encounter determined resistance at Samar, Kurita wavered. Despite opportunities to crush smaller American escort carriers and destroyers, he turned back. The war's last great chance for a surface victory dissolved into retreat. For Japan, the consequences were devastating. Operation Shō-Gō had been conceived as a gamble for national survival. Its failure meant the Philippines would fall, cutting the empire's lifeline to the oil fields of the East Indies. Without that oil, the engines of war, ships, aircraft, tanks, would soon fall silent. In a very real sense, Musashi's grave beneath the Sibuyan Sea was also the grave of Japan's naval power. Yet beyond strategy and fuel lines, there was the human cost. Over 1,000 men went down with the ship. Their names were recorded, but their voices silenced forever. Families across Japan would wait in vain for news, clinging to fading hopes. Mothers prayed before home altars, wives lit incense, children asked when their fathers would return. The answers never came. Those who survived bore scars not visible in photographs. Many spoke little of what they had seen. Some were haunted by the screams of comrades trapped below decks, pounding against sealed hatches as the water rose. Others could never forget the sight of Captain Toshihira Inoguchi, who chose to remain aboard. His decision embodied the warrior code of Bushido, but for his men it was a bitter image. A leader vanishing into darkness while they struggled to survive. For the Americans, the sinking of Musashi was confirmation of a truth they already suspected. Battleships, no matter how massive, were no match for carrier aviation. Pilots returned to their carriers exhausted, but triumphant. Some had seen her bow already submerged, others watched her final plunge. To them, she was a target destroyed. To history, she was proof that the age of the carrier had dawned. In the years after the war, historians and naval architects debated her meaning. Some called her a magnificent anachronism, a monument to outdated thinking. Others saw her as a tragic masterpiece, a marvel of engineering undone by the rapid pace of innovation. In either view, her legacy was inescapable. She had been designed to dominate a kind of battle that no longer existed. Even today, when explorers discovered her wreck nearly a mile beneath the Sibuyan Sea, the sight was haunting. Her turrets still pointed outward, her steel hull broken yet still immense. The sea had softened her edges, covering her wounds with silt, but the scale of her remained staggering. Divers who studied her reported a profound silence, as if the ocean itself preserved the dignity of the fallen. For many Japanese, Musashi's story remains both pride and sorrow. Pride in the craftsmanship, the dedication, the sheer audacity of building such a ship, sorrow in knowing that so much sacrifice ended in futility. The lesson resonates far beyond naval history. No weapon, however mighty, can defy the tide of change. Strategy, technology, and above all, human lives determine the outcome of wars. The Sibuyan Sea, calm once more after that terrible day, became not just a grave but a warning. It whispered that hubris carries a cost, that clinging to old visions can lead to ruin, and that even the mightiest can fall in silence beneath the waves. And so in the twilight of October 24th, 1944, the ocean claimed more than steel. It claimed the last hope of an empire desperate to hold back the inevitable. The ripples of that loss spread far, shaping the outcome of the Pacific War and sealing the fate of a nation. The Sibuyan Sea holds the wreck of Musashi in silence, nearly a mile beneath the waves. Once the mightiest battleship ever to sail, she now lies broken, softened by time, a monument to both ambition and tragedy. Her story is not simply about steel and fire, but about the men who lived and died within her, and about a world in the midst of profound change. For centuries, battleships had been symbols of power, the pride of nations. Musashi was the ultimate expression of that belief, 73,000 tons of armor and firepower meant to dominate the seas. Yet she never fought the battle for which she was designed. Instead, she was destroyed not by another battleship, but by waves of American carrier aircraft. The truth was undeniable. The age of battleships was over. The future belonged to carriers, and in the crucible of World War II, the balance of naval power shifted forever. But beyond strategy, her fate carries a deeper lesson. Pride and technology alone cannot secure victory. Innovation moves faster than steel, and those who fail to adapt are swept aside. For Japan, Musashi's death was the collapse of a dream, the end of Kai Kessan, and a bitter symbol of a nation struggling against forces it could no longer control. Today, when we look back at World War II, we remember not only the victories and defeats, but also the human stories, the sailors who fought, the families who waited, and the voices lost to the sea. Musashi reminds us that no weapon is eternal, no empire unshakable, and that in every age of war there is always a greater cost than steel. In the end, her legacy is not in the thunder of her great guns, but in the silence of her grave, and that silence speaks still, of sacrifice, of lessons learned, and of the hope that from the ashes of World War II, peace might finally rise.